This story doesn't start with injustice. It starts with confidence. A woman at the top assumed silence meant surrender. She never questioned why two boys were still watching after she moved on. By the time she realized, the ending had already been rewritten. Victory feels safest when no one questions it. For the black billionaire woman at the center of this story, success had long stopped feeling like an achievement and started feeling like a condition. It existed around her as atmosphere, as expectation, as proof that whatever choices she made would eventually be justified by outcome. Winning to her was no longer an event. It was a state of being. Her belief that the game was already over did not come from arrogance in the obvious sense. It came from repetition. Years of consistent outcomes had trained her instincts to expect alignment. Decisions led to results. Results reinforced reputation. Reputation opened doors before effort was required. Over time, this sequence hardened into certainty. The idea of losing felt abstract, theoretical, something that happened to others who miscalculated, not to someone who had mastered the system. Success introduced a subtle emotional blindness, not the kind that erased empathy entirely, but the kind that narrowed focus. She learned to measure people by their usefulness, moments by their efficiency, outcomes by their scalability. Complexity became noise. Anything that did not immediately affect her trajectory felt irrelevant. This was not cruelty, it was optimization. And optimization, repeated long enough, begins to feel like truth. Power sustained itself through a self-validation loop. Each success confirmed the logic that produced it. Each confirmation reduced the need for reflection. Advisors echoed confidence because confidence produced stability. Institutions responded predictably because predictability preserved order. Even criticism, when it appeared, arrived framed as adjustment rather than challenge. The system did not confront her assumptions, it rewarded them. In this environment, winning became synonymous with control. Control over narrative, over access, over outcomes. The distinction between influence and ownership blurred. She believed that because she could shape the direction of events, she also determined their meaning. The story, as far as she was concerned, belonged to her, and stories that belong to the powerful rarely invite edits. The idea that someone else might still be engaged after the conclusion never occurred to her. In her experience, endings were defined by authority. When she moved on, the moment ended. When she closed a chapter, the story was done. Silence from others confirmed resolution. The absence of resistance felt like agreement. What she failed to consider was that silence can also be assessment. That disengagement can mask attention. That endings declared by power are not always endings recognized by those without it. Her confidence depended on visible response. She had learned to read outcomes through reaction, applause, compliance, withdrawal. When none appeared, she assumed victory by default. This assumption was reinforced by scale. At her level, consequences rarely arrived directly. They filtered through layers of process, time, and interpretation. Distance softened impact. Delay reduced urgency. By the time results became visible, they were often disconnected from the choices that produced them. This allowed her to maintain a sense of control even when control was already shifting. Winning also reshaped her emotional posture. It reduced curiosity. Questions felt unnecessary when answers had already worked before. Reflection felt inefficient when momentum demanded continuity. The habit of winning discouraged pause. It rewarded decisiveness over doubt. And doubt, left unpracticed, weakened with time. The illusion of final victory thrives in such conditions. It convinces power that observation has ended, that attention has moved elsewhere. It frames silence as closure rather than preparation. The billionaire woman did not see watchers because she no longer expected them. In her experience, those who mattered made themselves known. Those who didn't faded. This belief allowed her to proceed without caution. She reorganized priorities, shifted focus, and redirected attention toward new objectives. The past resolved itself automatically, or so it seemed. The system around her reinforced this movement, offering no signal that anything remained unsettled. Efficiency rewarded forward motion. Reflection slowed it, yet beneath this sense of closure, something remained open. Not a conflict, not a challenge, not even a grievance. Just attention. Unacknowledged and unclaimed. Attention that did not seek permission. Attention that did not announce itself. Attention that did not mistake the end of interaction for the end of relevance. The billionaire woman believed the story was over because she had stopped telling it. She did not check who was still listening, still remembering, still mapping what had occurred. She did not consider that winning without witnesses is different from winning without consequences. And she did not imagine that someone, somewhere outside her field of vision, might still be engaged with an ending she had already declared final. because the most dangerous moment for power is not when it is challenged, but when it assumes the challenge has already passed. Some people grow up knowing the world won't listen to them. For the two black boys at the center of this story, that understanding did not arrive as disappointment. It arrived as fact. Their lives unfolded in places where attention was scarce and interest was conditional. Not because they lacked ability, but because systems had already decided who deserved to be noticed and who could be passed over without consequence. They were born into circumstances defined less by chaos and more by neglect. Resources existed elsewhere. Opportunity circulated but rarely paused. Institutions appeared inconsistently, offering rules without protection and expectations without patience. From an early age, both boys learned that asking for recognition often cost more than it gave. Silence became safer than explanation. Observation became more useful than appeal. Invisibility was not an exception in their lives, it was the default condition. Teachers rotated, programs ended. Promises expired quietly. Nothing dramatic happened often enough to demand attention. Instead, there was a steady accumulation of being overlooked. Over time, this taught them an unspoken lesson: survival did not require being seen. It required being accurate. Their intelligence developed differently from those raised with access. Privilege intelligence relied on instruction, reinforcement, and correction. Survival intelligence relied on pattern recognition. One was taught through guidance, the other through consequence. The boys learned how environments shifted under pressure, how authority responded selectively, how systems enforced rules unevenly. They learned which behaviors drew scrutiny and which allowed passage. This difference shaped their emotional lives. Restraint was not a virtue they admired, it was a necessity they practiced. Emotional reactions attracted attention they could not control. Calm preserved options. Over time, they learned to regulate what they revealed and when. Their expressions remained neutral not because they felt nothing, but because feeling everything all at once was inefficient. They did not confuse their position with inferiority. They understood their placement within a structure that ranked value unevenly. This clarity prevented bitterness from taking root. Anger required energy. Energy was needed elsewhere. Instead of resisting the system openly, they studied it quietly. They watched how outcomes changed depending on who spoke, not what was said. Their days were shaped by adjustment. Routes changed. Plans shifted. Expectations recalibrated constantly. This trained them to remain flexible without becoming unstable. They did not expect fairness, but they recognized consistency when it appeared. They noticed when rules bent and when they hardened. These observations accumulated into understanding, not resentment. The absence of visibility also created freedom. Without expectations, there was less pressure to perform. Without attention, there was space to think. They used that space deliberately. One focused on repetition, noticing how the same outcomes appeared under similar conditions. The other focused on timing, recognizing when action mattered and when it did not. Together, they built awareness without announcing it. Their silence was often misread. Adults interpreted it as disengagement. Institutions labeled it compliance. Authority assumed agreement. None of these interpretations were accurate, but accuracy was not required for the system to function. The boys learned that misinterpretation could be useful. Being underestimated reduced interference. Reduced interference preserved agency. They did not see themselves as victims. They saw themselves as participants in a structure that rarely acknowledged them. This perspective grounded them. It allowed them to move without illusion. They did not wait for permission that would never arrive. They did not expect validation that had already been assigned elsewhere. What connected them was not shared ambition, but shared understanding. Loyalty formed through consistency rather than conversation. They trusted each other because both understood the cost of miscalculation. They covered gaps instinctively, adjusting without discussion. Their bond was quiet, functional, and resilient. In a world that measured worth through visibility, their invisibility protected them. It allowed them to watch without being watched, to learn without being tested, to exist without being evaluated. This position was not chosen, but it was used. They did not announce growth. They accumulated it. The system never meant for their lives to matter in the ways that were counted. That realization did not discourage them. It clarified their role. They would not be central characters by design. They would exist at the margins, where patterns were easier to see and assumptions went unchecked. Their silence hid more than resignation. It hid attention sharpened by necessity, intelligence refined by consequence, and patience developed without instruction. What others mistook for absence was preparation. What looked like insignificance was positioning. Their silence hid something no one expected, Not every loss looks like a fight. Some losses pass quietly, mistaken for closure simply because they leave no marks. The moment unfolded without confrontation, without raised voices, without any visible rupture. It appeared ordinary, almost forgettable, which is precisely why it was misread. For the billionaire woman, it registered as resolution. For the boys, it became reference. From her perspective, the interaction ended the way most things did when she moved on. There was no resistance to overcome, no challenge to manage, no narrative to defend. Authority did not need to assert itself because it was already assumed. The absence of pushback confirmed her belief that the matter had settled itself. In her world, conflict announced itself. Silence meant compliance. The dismissal was social, not direct. It arrived through posture, timing, and ease rather than words. A brief signal communicated hierarchy efficiently, placing the boys where the system expected them to be. No insult was required. No instruction followed. The message was delivered through confidence alone. In that instant, the billionaire woman classified the encounter as inconsequential and moved forward without hesitation. The boys did not react. There was no visible shift in expression, no attempt to correct the assumption forming in front of them. Their stillness was interpreted as defeat, because power often confuses quiet with surrender. The lack of response reinforced the belief that the moment had resolved itself in her favor. The system around her accepted that conclusion without question. This was the miscalculation. Power had measured outcome by reaction and found none. It had equated silence with absence and moved on. What it failed to account for was the kind of attention that does not announce itself. The boys' reaction-free response was not the result of confusion or fear. It was a deliberate withholding. They registered the dismissal with clarity. Not as insult, but as information. The way authority behaved when unchallenged revealed more than confrontation ever could. The ease of the gesture, the certainty behind it, the lack of curiosity about consequence, all of it was noted. They did not need to respond to understand what had been revealed. In the structure they inhabited, reacting would have confirmed the hierarchy being imposed. It would have centered the power that dismissed them and invited consequences they could not control. Silence preserved autonomy. It allowed the moment to remain theirs, unclaimed by authority. By choosing not to engage, they avoided becoming characters in someone else's conclusion. The billionaire woman mistook this restraint for defeat because her experience had taught her to expect resistance from anything that mattered. In her world, significance announced itself through challenge. Anything that failed to push back faded. The boys did neither. They remained present without asserting relevance, a position the system was unequipped to interpret. This gap between perception and reality widened immediately. She moved on believing the outcome was final. They moved forward carrying the moment with precision. What she discarded as resolved became part of their understanding of how power operated when it believed it had won. The asymmetry mattered. One side assumed closure. The other began analysis. Power's greatest vulnerability often appears at the moment it believes there is nothing left to manage. That belief allows attention to drift. It encourages shortcuts. It reduces vigilance. The billionaire woman's confidence did not come from arrogance, but from habit. Outcomes had consistently validated her assumptions. This moment felt no different, yet for the boys, it was distinct. Not because it was louder or harsher than what they had experienced before, but because of who delivered it. The dismissal came from a position that represented the peak of the system they had been studying from the margins. The interaction confirmed patterns they had observed abstractly. Now those patterns had a face. Their silence functioned as storage. It held detail without distortion. It preserved sequence, tone, and implication. Nothing was discarded. Nothing was exaggerated. The moment was set aside intact, ready to be compared against future observations. This method had served them before. It would serve them again. What the billionaire woman interpreted as a clean ending was, in reality, an open file. She had concluded the exchange because she had no reason to revisit it. They kept it active because it explained more than it resolved. The system had spoken clearly, even if quietly. This was not a turning point in appearance. It was a calibration. The boys adjusted their understanding of scale, influence, and assumption. They did not feel wrong. They felt informed. That distinction mattered. Emotion clouds memory. Clarity sharpens it. The moment passed without consequence on the surface. No one else noticed. Nothing changed immediately. That is why it was dangerous. Power often measures risk by disruption. Here there was none. The real shift occurred internally, unnoticed and unchallenged. What looked like surrender was actually storage. Silence terrifies power only when it understands it. Until then, silence is usually mistaken for absence, confusion, or defeat. In the days following the encounter, the billionaire woman interpreted the quiet that followed as confirmation. There were no complaints, no escalation, no visible response. From her vantage point, the moment dissolved cleanly into irrelevance. The system she trusted offered no indication that anything remained unsettled. For the boys, silence functioned differently. It was not the end of reaction, but the beginning of calibration. They did not rush to label what had happened or attach emotion to it prematurely. Silence gave them time to sort signal from noise. It allowed details to settle into place without distortion. In their world, haste created exposure. Exposure invited consequence. Silence reduced both. This strategic pause was not a tactic learned from instruction, but from repetition. Hardship had taught them that reactions often benefited those already in control. The louder the response, the easier it was for power to frame, dismiss, or redirect it. Silence denied that advantage. It withheld material. It delayed interpretation. It preserved leverage without revealing intent. Emotional regulation shaped by necessity supported this restraint. They did not suppress feeling, they sequenced it. Disappointment, awareness, and resolve were acknowledged internally, then set aside until they could be used constructively. Anger was not eliminated. It was deferred. Hardship had trained them to manage emotion as a resource, not an impulse. The difference between fear and patience became central. Fear freezes or lashes out. Patience watches and adjusts. The boys understood this distinction clearly. Their stillness was not paralysis. It was readiness without urgency. They remained engaged, alert, and observant even as they presented no outward signal of it. This balance confused systems accustomed to reading reaction as relevance. Power's false confidence thrives on predictable responses. It expects noise from resistance and compliance from silence. Anything outside that binary often goes unnoticed. The billionaire woman's certainty rested on this assumption. She believed that if something mattered, it would announce itself. If someone felt wronged, they would object. If a situation carried risk, it would surface through disruption. Silence challenged none of these expectations, which is why it was dismissed. The absence of visible consequence allowed confidence to solidify. The encounter became a closed loop in her mind, resolved by default. The system around her reinforced that conclusion by moving on without friction. Efficiency rewarded closure. Attention shifted elsewhere. Meanwhile, the boys remained quiet by design. They did not test conclusions prematurely. They did not share observations broadly. Silence protected the accuracy of what they were collecting. It kept them beneath thresholds that triggered scrutiny. Their invisibility, already familiar, now served an additional purpose. It allowed them to observe without altering behavior around them. This misreading widened the gap between perception and reality. Power assumed disengagement. Patience sustained engagement. The asymmetry grew without announcement. The boys did not seek confirmation that their silence was effective. They relied on consistency. Patterns continued uninterrupted. Authority behaved as expected. Systems repeated their habits. Nothing changed because nothing appeared challenged. The billionaire woman's confidence deepened as time passed without incident. She reorganized focus toward new objectives, confident that prior matters had concluded. Silence reinforced her belief in control. It validated her interpretation of events. In her experience, silence from others had always meant resolution. She had never needed to question that assumption. What she could not see was that silence had shifted function. It was no longer merely a condition imposed by circumstance. It had become an instrument chosen deliberately. The boys were not waiting for permission or opportunity. They were aligning understanding with timing. Silence kept options open. It allowed the system to reveal itself further. The quiet also altered responsibility. Without visible conflict, there was no pressure to intervene or correct. Authority continued operating under its own logic, unguarded. This unguarded state mattered. Systems are most revealing when they believe they are unobserved. Silence created that illusion. As days passed, the absence of reaction hardened into assumption. The billionaire woman did not revisit the moment because nothing invited her to. Her confidence required no maintenance. The system functioned smoothly. Silence, from her perspective, had completed its role. From the boys' perspective, the quiet had only begun working. Each uneventful day added context. Each repeated behavior confirmed patterns. They learned how long assumptions lasted, how quickly attention moved on, how rarely power reconsidered its own conclusions. Silence became confirmation, not of defeat, but of access. The danger lay in this misalignment. Power believed the situation was closed. Patience treated it as ongoing. One side disengaged. The other remained focused. This imbalance did not announce itself. It accumulated quietly, reinforced by routine and repetition. Silence did not confront power, and therefore did not alert it. It did not provoke defense or retaliation. It allowed power to remain comfortable, which made it vulnerable. The billionaire woman's false confidence was not rooted in arrogance, but in habit. Habits persist until interrupted, the quiet continued. And that continuity, unbroken and unchallenged, became the most dangerous part of all. The powerful rarely rewatch their own moves. They experience life in forward motion, where outcomes matter more than process and success validates intent. For the billionaire woman, her inner narrative had been written over years of winning. Each chapter reinforced the last, creating a story so consistent that it no longer required review. She did not see herself as someone making choices. She saw herself as someone fulfilling momentum. Her internal story framed success as evidence of correctness. Decisions were not merely effective, they were right. This belief did not arise from ego alone, but from confirmation repeated often enough to feel objective. When every major risk produced reward, doubt began to look unnecessary. Reflection felt redundant. The past became a proof, not a lesson. Confirmation bias settled in quietly. Each favorable outcome filtered memory, emphasizing what worked and minimizing what did not. Near misses were reframed as strategy. Warnings were interpreted as cautionary noise. Over time, her mind selected evidence that supported continuity. She did not ignore contradiction consciously. She rarely encountered it in a form that demanded attention. Advisors played their part, not out of malice, but alignment. Their roles depended on preserving momentum. They offered perspectives that reinforced direction rather than questioned premise. Language softened risk. Concerns became considerations. Doubt was reframed as optional. The system around her learned to present information in ways that fit the story she already believed. Admiration completed the loop. Public recognition validated private certainty. Media narratives celebrated decisiveness and resilience, rarely lingering on cost or consequence. Philanthropy reinforced moral authority, blurring the line between influence and virtue. Each layer of admiration insulated her from friction. The story she told herself was echoed back with polish. Winning created blind spots not because it hid reality, but because it narrowed relevance. Anything outside the winning narrative felt peripheral. Complexity was reduced to efficiency. People were categorized by impact rather than presence. The world became a sequence of solvable problems rather than an ecosystem of consequences. In this environment, revisiting past interactions felt unnecessary. The story moved forward, and so did she. The encounter with the boys remained unexamined because it did not disrupt outcome. Silence confirmed resolution. There was nothing to revise, nothing to question. The system had already closed the file. What she failed to notice was that stories reinforced by power are rarely complete. They exclude perspectives that do not influence immediate result. They omit experiences that do not challenge trajectory. This omission does not feel like error. It feels like efficiency. And efficiency, when rewarded consistently, becomes justification. Blind spots formed where curiosity once lived. Questions that might have unsettled certainty were replaced by assumptions that preserved it. The idea that someone outside her narrative might still be engaged with a concluded moment did not register. In her experience, relevance required visibility. Anything unseen faded automatically. This belief shaped her reactions as new developments emerged. When subtle inconsistencies appeared, she interpreted them through the lens of continuity. Adjustments were temporary. Resistance was situational. Nothing suggested structural error. Her story accounted for deviation without revision. Meanwhile, the system continued responding to her with deference. Processes adjusted to maintain coherence. Outcomes aligned just enough to avoid disruption. This reinforcement delayed recognition. Power rarely fails loudly at first. It drifts, cushioned by systems designed to preserve stability. Her certainty began to harden. What once felt confident now felt fixed. Flexibility narrowed. Curiosity diminished. The story no longer adapted, it defended itself. This shift was subtle but consequential. Stories that stop evolving eventually collide with realities they can no longer explain. The boys existed outside this narrative entirely. Their silence never entered her story because it did not announce itself. She did not consider alternative interpretations because her story did not require them. Winning had trained her to expect closure, not continuation. As time passed, the blind spots expanded. Small signals accumulated without integration. Discomfort appeared without clear cause. Her story accounted for everything except the possibility that it was incomplete. This was the cost of believing one's own narrative too fully. It replaced vigilance with assumption. Her certainty began working against her not because it was false, but because it was unexamined. It prevented recalibration. It discouraged listening. It framed emerging complexity as anomaly rather than information. The story that once propelled her forward now resisted correction. Power believes its own story because believing it has always worked. Until it doesn't, those outside the system often see its cracks first. For the boys, distance was not a disadvantage, it was a lens. They had never been invited into rooms where decisions were formalized, but they had spent years watching the consequences ripple outward from those rooms. From sidewalks, waiting areas, and overlooked spaces, they learned to trace cause through effect. They did not study people. They studied systems. People were inconsistent. Systems were not. Authority changed faces, but procedures repeated. The boys learned to separate personality from structure. They noticed how outcomes followed incentives more reliably than intentions. When decisions were framed as neutral, they asked who benefited from that neutrality. When rules were enforced unevenly, they noted where enforcement softened and where it hardened. This was not cynicism. It was accuracy developed under constraint. Rules were visible and brittle. Patterns were quieter and durable. The boys learned to prioritize the latter. Rules explained what was supposed to happen. Patterns explained what actually did. They observed how exceptions clustered around certain names, how delays appeared selectively, how accountability shifted depending on visibility. Over time, these repetitions formed a map, not of morality but of movement. Their knowledge was gained without permission. No one authorized their learning. No institution validated it. They learned because survival demanded comprehension. Mistakes carried cost, so attention sharpened. They tested assumptions against repetition. If an outcome occurred once, it was coincidence. If it occurred repeatedly under similar conditions, it was structure. This discipline protected them from overconfidence and from error. They also learned what not to do. They saw how premature action drew scrutiny and how scrutiny triggered defenses. Systems responded aggressively to disruption but slowly to alignment. The boys concluded that confrontation revealed intent too early. It invited correction before leverage existed. Silence, by contrast, preserved access. It allowed the system to continue behaving naturally, unguarded by awareness. Quiet leverage formed through accumulation, not exposure. It did not require influence in the traditional sense. It required timing, alignment, and restraint. The boys understood that leverage often appeared where incentives conflicted with narratives. Where the story said one thing and the process did another, friction emerged. They cataloged these gaps patiently, knowing that gaps widened when unacknowledged. Importantly, they did not personalize their observations. This was not about the billionaire woman as an individual. It was about the ecosystem that elevated her. Detachment preserved clarity. Emotional investment would have distorted analysis. By keeping their focus structural, they avoided misreading motive as mechanism. Systems behaved predictably when observed without judgment. They noticed how power anticipated opposition but overlooked observation. Oversight focused on known threats. Attention flowed upward, rarely outward. This created blind corridors where behavior went unexamined. The boys learned where these corridors intersected with process. They learned which questions were asked reflexively and which were never asked at all. Absence became data. As their understanding deepened, they resisted the temptation to act. Action felt premature without confirmation. Instead, they refined their map. They compared context, tested consistency, and tracked change over time. This patience was not passive. It was active restraint. They were building accuracy, not momentum. Meanwhile, the system continued functioning as designed. Authority moved confidently, supported by habit and affirmation. This continuity mattered. It allowed the boys to observe without altering variables. The more predictable behavior became, the clearer the structure appeared. Stability revealed design. Design revealed vulnerability. Quiet leverage also depended on anonymity. The boys remained unnamed, unremarkable, and untracked. Their invisibility protected their insight. Recognition would have invited interpretation. Interpretation would have invited correction. Remaining unseen preserved neutrality. Neutrality preserved access. They began to understand something: fundamental systems do not fear opposition as much as they fear misalignment. Opposition can be framed, absorbed, or dismissed. Misalignment exposes process. It forces recalibration. The boys did not seek to confront. They sought to align facts until outcomes could no longer be ignored. This understanding shaped how they interpreted the earlier dismissal. It was not a loss. It was data. It confirmed how power behaved when unchallenged and how quickly it moved on. The boys integrated this into their map, adjusting expectations accordingly. They learned how long assumptions lasted and how rarely they were revisited. Their leverage did not announce itself because it did not need to. It existed as readiness. It existed in timing. It existed in knowing when not to act. The boys did not mistake understanding for control. Control belonged to authority. Understanding belonged to observation. And understanding, applied correctly, could redirect outcomes without confrontation. As weeks passed, their comprehension outpaced visibility. They knew where attention would go before it moved. They recognized which signals mattered and which were decorative. They understood the rhythm of response and the delay of correction. This foresight was not prophecy. It was pattern recognition practiced consistently. They now understood something she never learned. That winning teaches power to stop watching. That silence can be engagement without exposure. That systems reveal themselves most clearly when they believe no one is paying attention. Confidence weakens the moment it needs reassurance. For the billionaire woman, the change did not arrive as crisis, but as interruption. Her world still functioned, schedules remained full, and outcomes continued to align. Yet something beneath the surface no longer felt settled. The ease that once accompanied decision-making began to thin. What had been instinctive now required confirmation. She sensed subtle instability first in timing. Processes that once moved seamlessly began to hesitate. Responses arrived complete but slower, as if routed through additional layers of consideration. No one challenged her directly. No authority was questioned openly. Instead, certainty started asking for explanation. Decisions that previously closed discussions now opened them. This shift was small, but persistent. Authority requiring explanation felt unfamiliar. She had grown accustomed to deference expressed through efficiency. Now efficiency was replaced with procedure. Clarifications were requested. Context was revisited. The system still responded to her, but it no longer anticipated her intent with the same precision. This did not look like resistance. It felt like distance. Her narrative began to slip at the edges. The story she told herself about continuity and control no longer accounted for every outcome. Minor inconsistencies appeared without clear cause. Adjustments fixed symptoms but not source. The story remained intact, yet required maintenance. And stories that require maintenance invite doubt. Control without clarity created tension. She could still direct outcomes, but she could no longer predict their reception. Influence functioned, but its impact varied. This variability unsettled her more than opposition ever had. Opposition provided shape. It could be confronted, reframed, or absorbed. Ambiguity resisted all three. She responded instinctively by reinforcing presence. Visibility increased. Communication sharpened. These actions stabilized perception but failed to restore comfort. Confidence remained, but it was no longer effortless. It required attention. The need for reassurance, even unacknowledged, signaled vulnerability. Internally, she revisited recent decisions, searching for missteps. None stood out. Her logic remained sound. Her track record remained strong. This absence of explanation deepened unease. When cause cannot be located, suspicion spreads. She began questioning not choices, but environment. The system felt altered, though she could not identify when or how. Her advisors noticed the shift but struggled to articulate it. Language softened further. Risk was framed cautiously. Certainty was expressed conditionally. These adjustments, meant to support stability, inadvertently reinforced her sense that something had changed. Reassurance, when overused, loses credibility. The loss of narrative control weighed heavier than any operational concern. She had always understood her position within the story. She knew where she stood and how others perceived her. Now, perception felt less fixed. Not negative, but unsettled. The audience still listened, but attention felt distributed rather than focused. Authority diffused subtly. This diffusion created a new kind of awareness. She became more alert, scanning for signals that previously felt unnecessary. Attention that once flowed outward now turned inward. This inward turn did not bring clarity. It brought awareness of fragility. Winning had insulated her from doubt. That insulation had thinned. Control, once reinforced by habit, now required intention. Intention slowed momentum. Momentum had been her ally. Without it, she felt exposed. Not threatened, but observed. The sensation was unfamiliar and difficult to name. It did not feel like opposition. It felt like scrutiny without source. She began noticing absence. Not of people, but of predictability. The system still behaved rationally, but less automatically. It responded to process rather than assumption. This recalibration shifted power subtly away from individual authority toward collective verification. Her influence remained central, but no longer singular. The discomfort lay in invisibility. She could not identify who or what prompted the change. There was no voice to answer, no concern to address. The system appeared self-correcting. This autonomy unsettled her. Authority depends on awareness of boundaries. Here, boundaries blurred. She felt watched not by individuals but by alignment. Outcomes seemed to observe themselves. Processes reflected back inconsistencies she had not noticed before. This reflection was impersonal, but persistent. It did not accuse. It simply existed. The boys remained absent from her awareness. She did not connect the earlier moment to this shift. Her story did not allow for that link. She searched for visible causes because visibility had always mattered. What she did not consider was attention that operated without presence. Winning had stopped feeling secure because security depended on recognition. Recognition depended on visibility, and something unseen had entered the equation. Not a challenger, not a rival. An observer. She could sense it without naming it. A quiet pressure, tightening without announcement. The kind that does not demand response, but changes behavior simply by existing. She felt watched but could not see who was watching. Truth doesn't attack, it aligns. When it finally surfaced, it did not arrive with accusation or spectacle. It emerged through process, through sequence, through repetition. Systems that had once functioned on assumption began to expose themselves by simply continuing to operate. The same inputs no longer produced the same confidence. The same decisions no longer closed conversations. Nothing broke, nothing exploded. The structure revealed itself by behaving exactly as designed. For the billionaire woman, the change was difficult to locate because it had no face. There was no challenger to confront, no claim to refute. Instead, verification replaced trust. Processes that once deferred to authority began asking for coherence. Timelines were revisited. Outcomes were compared against intention. The system did not accuse her of being wrong. It asked her to be precise. Facts began replacing assumptions quietly. Data points that once lived separately were placed side by side. Small inconsistencies surfaced not as failures, but as questions. Decisions were still accepted, but they were no longer absorbed automatically. Authority remained present, yet it was required to share space with evidence. This recalibration felt subtle, almost courteous, which made it harder to resist. What unsettled her was the neutrality of it all. There was no emotion to counter, no motive to question. Facts carried no tone. They did not argue, they waited. Each verification felt reasonable in isolation. Together, they shifted the weight of certainty. Influence moved from personality to process, from confidence to consistency. Public perception adjusted without announcement. There was no reversal, no scandal, no sudden loss of status. Language softened. Praise became conditional. Narratives introduced nuance where absolutes once stood. The audience did not turn away, it leaned back. Admiration remained, but it was no longer automatic. The space between image and evaluation narrowed. This shift did not require exposure. It required alignment. When systems align with facts, outcomes recalibrate themselves. The billionaire woman sensed this change as pressure without direction. She could respond only by adapting, not by asserting. Assertion now invited verification. Adaptation demanded humility she had not practiced in years. The boys remained unseen throughout this process. They did not announce insight or claim influence. Their role was not to intervene, but to remain invisible long enough for alignment to occur naturally. Visibility would have personalized the shift. Personalization would have triggered defense. Their absence preserved neutrality. They understood that confrontation invites resistance. Alignment invites correction. Systems resist attack but respond to coherence. By allowing processes to reveal their own inconsistencies, they ensured that truth belonged to the structure itself, not to individuals. This distinction mattered. Outcomes corrected without assigning blame. As facts accumulated, power began to erode quietly. Not through collapse, but through redistribution. Authority no longer rested solely on assumption. It shared space with verification. The billionaire woman still held influence, but it no longer moved unchecked. Each decision now existed within a wider context, accountable to pattern rather than perception. Internally, this forced a reckoning she could not articulate publicly. Her certainty had not vanished, but it had lost dominance. Confidence adjusted under scrutiny. Control shifted from narrative to process. The system no longer echoed her intent back to her unchanged. It reflected it with context. What made the moment irreversible was its subtlety. There was no point of return because there was no single point of change. The recalibration occurred through accumulation. Each reasonable request, each clarified metric, each revisited assumption moved the balance incrementally. Resistance had appeared unreasonable. Acceptance became the only viable response. The boys watched without interfering. Their patience preserved the outcome. They understood that recognition would dilute impact. By remaining unnamed, they allowed the system to correct itself without distraction. The truth did not need advocates. It needed continuity. As perception continued to shift, The billionaire woman adjusted her posture. Authority remained, but it no longer defined the terms unilaterally. The environment felt altered, not hostile. The system had not turned against her. It had matured beyond deference. The balance began to tilt not toward punishment, but toward equilibrium. Influence redistributed itself across verification, context, and accountability. The story no longer belonged to a single narrator. It unfolded through alignment rather than assertion. Truth had not confronted power. It had simply stood in the right place long enough to be noticed. Stories like this only matter if they continue beyond the screen. If this made you pause, reflect, or question how power really works, let it travel further. Support thoughtful stories that value awareness over noise. Your engagement helps decide which stories deserve to be told next. This story wasn't about winning or losing. It was about who kept watching after everyone else moved on. In your own life, when was the last time silence around you meant something important was still unfolding?